Hey guys, welcome back to Mondays at the Museum. I'm Carrie and I'm here at the Anna Bemis Palmer Museum in York, Nebraska. So, today, as many Americans sit around the tree celebrating the Christmas of 2023, let us not forget that fateful night 247 years ago when Washington and his men put up a great fight. So, it's 1776 and George Washington and his men cross the Delaware River on Christmas night. Why did Washington cross the river? To get to this? No, it was just a surprise attack. A Hessian garrison in Trenton, New Jersey, made up of about 1,400 men. These Hessians, to put it bluntly, were German mercenaries that fought for the British Army. Festive, right? But Washington was smart. He knew it was festive. He was banking on it being festive. Washington knew that not only did his men celebrate, but also the guys across the river, and he wanted to use that to his advantage. He knew that after this celebrating, maybe these men would be inebriated or unable to fight at the level that they normally do. And he was right. They were affected, but things are not as easy as I'm making them seem. So let's back up a little bit. We know that 1776 was the year that we gained our independence. We also know that George Washington was a big part of that. And we know that the British had a little problem letting go. But to understand the magnitude of this story, you need to know the surrounding facts. So let's call this episode 10 Things About Washington Crossing the Delaware That You May or May Not Know. Catchy, right? Fact number one, there was a lot that led into this victory. So Washington's men had actually been defeated so many times that they were driven completely out of New York. They went all the way across New Jersey, they crossed the Delaware River, and they fell back in Pennsylvania. Now, the enemy army is hot on their tail this whole way, but they stop at the Delaware River without crossing because it is the dead of winter and they fight in seasons. So they think, well, it's winter, we're done for the season. We're just going to call it quits until the warmer weather comes around. And the British troops actually go back to New York. Their commander goes all the way back to London, and that leaves this Hessian garrison to basically camp out on the river and babysit the Americans for the winter season. Now, if Washington is able to cross and conquer them, this would be the biggest victory and major first victory for the Continental Army. And Washington needs a win, okay? He has lost so many times that his men have completely lost hope. Fact number two, it was necessary to go at night. So because they were being babysat literally across the river by these mercenaries, they had to go in the cover of darkness or the Hessians would realize that they're gone. The entire plan counted on the surprise attack specifically so they wouldn't be able to fight back. Fact number three, this wasn't a sudden decision. Washington didn't wake up at midnight and be like, yeah, let's cross the river. That's a great idea. No, Washington actually laid his secret plans out well in advance, and this included several councils of war on the subject. And because of all this planning, it did not remain secret for long. There was actually a British spy somewhere within the ranks. To this day, we have no idea who it was. But he passed on this plan to British authorities, who then passed it on to the Hessian leader. And literally, the Hessian guy was like, meh, if they're going to attack, let them attack, and we will just kill them with our bayonets. You would think that he is either incredibly stupid or just plain lazy, but honestly, he had been given so many false leads over time that he just thought this was just another one of them. And also, the Americans have yet to have a big victory, so are we even a threat in the first place? Fact number four, it wasn't all rainbow kisses and unicorn stickers that night. Washington's men were tired and underpaid and overwhelmed and underappreciated and ridiculously cold. It's the dead of winter. Plus there was a storm because, why not? And they were feeling those things pretty hard. They were also down to only about 10% of the men that they had started with. Basically, because of all those losses, yes, men had died, but also desertion level was at an all-time high and their numbers had just completely dwindled. Washington hoped that a victory such as this would be just the morale booster that they needed to motivate these men to stay and keep fighting for their country. He also hoped that it would motivate men back at home to sign up for the new year. Fact number five, the art piece. Little inaccurate. Okay, you all know the one, right? There's the boats, Washington standing on the front of the boat, crossing the icy river. It was painted in 1851 by a German artist named Emanuel Lutz. Okay, first off, the flag, totally wrong. They did not use that flag until months later. Secondly, and I know you're going to be super disappointed, but Washington did not stand on the front of the boat when they crossed the river. Remember that. It's cold. It's dark. The river is completely frozen over, and he's 44 years old at this point. One does not simply stand on the front of a boat in all of that. These Durham boats also had high walls, also not depicted in the painting. You're not going to stand on top of these walls. It's not a leap to say some people were standing inside the boat to avoid the cold and wet bottom, but you're not going to stand on top of these walls, least of all Washington, because strong gust of wind or a strong wave and you fall into the water, and then what? Hypothermia, or it's dark, maybe you fall overboard and they don't even find you and they have to leave you behind. And then what's going to happen to our country? Even if there were guys on top, it's not going to be Washington. He does have a whole crew of guys specifically from New England that were hired to lead these boats across the water, and that was specifically because their extensive experience on the water. Third, the river was only 300 yards across, not some giant crossing that this painting made it out to be. I'm just slightly bitter. But just because it wasn't entirely accurate doesn't mean it wasn't effective. This painting actually became a symbol in American culture. The fact that you knew exactly what painting I'm referring to this day, this many years later, shows how important it was. People admired him, and it made him look like a hero. Now, would people admire him as much if he were depicted as crouched over and cold and miserable? Probably not. Regardless, the painting was a hit worldwide, a true American treasure, and now it sits in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Fact number 6. Washington's wasn't the only attempt to cross that night. There were actually 3 attempts that were happening simultaneously, but only his group successfully made it across. So there was Colonel Cadwalder, who had a force of about 1,800 men, and they were to cross, and their job was specifically to harass and prevent nearby units from joining this enemy Hessian army. There was also General James Ewing, who had another 800 men, and their job was to take up defensive positions along the river so the Hessians couldn't retreat. And then there was Washington. He had roughly 2,400 soldiers. What they did was they crossed 10 miles north of Trenton and then marched to camp. Obviously, each group had more than one boat because, in Washington's group alone, he had 2,400 men, but he also had 200 horses and 18 cannons. So we know there were a lot of boats involved. We just don't have that exact number. The goal was to strike at dawn, but even then, the river was too strong, and Ewing and Cadwalder's men even failed to make it across. There was also a storm that was making everything difficult, and because of this and the cold weather, there were huge ice chunks that had to be constantly pushed out of the way in order for the boat to keep moving forward. Washington did eventually cross, but, fact number 7, it came 3 hours later than originally planned, and he almost canceled it completely. It wasn't his fault. Completely. His men were tired. It was dark. It was freezing. They had to march through the snow to get to where they had to cross, and then they had to do the cross, and then they had to march another 4 hours to get to Trenton. Washington actually wrote in his memoirs at this time, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered and harassed on repassing the river, I determined to push on at all events." Fact number 8, Washington wasn't the only famous American in this war, specifically even in this crossing. Future U.S. President James Monroe also crossed as part of the military. He was actually wounded at the Battle of Trenton. He was a lieutenant at the time, and he got shot by a musket ball in the shoulder. Now, majestically, there happened to be a doctor on site that saved his life and was able to tie that severed artery just in time. After the battle, he returned home and turned his attention to recruiting. There was also Alexander Hamilton, who was only around 20 years old at the time. Even though he was so young, he was actually so good at his job that he was put in charge of an artillery company and later became Washington's aide-de-camp. Fact number 9, Washington's plan worked. The Hessian army was completely caught off guard. Some stories say that because of the celebration, they were drunk or hungover due to the Christmas festivities the night before. But a lot of historians think that actually it's just because we arrived when they were asleep or groggy and they didn't have enough time to set up ranks and therefore get weapons prepared and everything like that. They also underestimated the Americans due to their constant defeats all over New York. In the end, Washington captured around 1,000 Hessian troops, and only a few Americans that were present in this battle died in the process. And then, fact number 10, the return trip to the river was even worse. So they had to go back, right? They had to cross back. And on that return, 3 soldiers actually fell in the Delaware and died. And this was due to a combination of factors. But obviously, the cross, we know from the earlier events, was rough. However, apparently, after the battle, they discovered the Hessian stash of rum and had taken advantage of that. Washington destroyed it, but not until after several of these drinks were taken. So our soldiers were inebriated, and I think that's where the stories of the inebriated Hessians comes from in the first place. So there are your 10 facts. Ladies and gentlemen, we are blessed to be with our loved ones this holiday season, blessed to live in the land of the free, and blessed to have Washington, the strategist that he was, as our leader at that time. So from me and my staff, I hope you have a Merry Christmas, and we'll see you next time.